city-council-tv, and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and FiOS Channel 964. We will be taking public testimony at the end of this hearing. If you wish to testify via video conference, you should email Michelle, MICHELLE.A.Goldberg, GOLDBERG, at boston.gov to sign up. And we do ask when you're called at the end of the hearing that you state your name and affiliation or residence and limit your comments to just 2 minutes, just so we can get everybody in. You can also submit written testimony by emailing ccc.wm, that's for Ways and Means, so ccc.wm@boston.gov, and we accept testimony after the hearing as well. Today's hearing is on docket 0226, order for a hearing regarding a mid-year update on the city's FY21 fiscal status. I'm joined here today by my colleagues, Councillor Ed Flynn from District 2, Councillor Liz Braden from District 9, Councillor Matt O'Malley, District 6, Councillor Andrea Campbell from District 4, and Councillor Michelle Wu at large. And I'm the sponsor of this hearing, and in my capacity as Ways and Means Chair, I called for it because it's always good at a halfway point to kind of know where the city's finances are, but this has been a more uncertain time than most. And there are a number of things since the city council passed this budget in late June for a July 1st fiscal year start. There's been a lot of moving pieces. So we've seen a lot of federal funds come in, get spent, not all get spent, some anticipated, et cetera. And then excise taxes, which are the taxes the city gets from hotels, restaurants, airplane fuel, car registrations, these things because of obviously the major impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our economy, those have been fluctuating and hard to predict. And in the context of that, however, we've also had a strong property tax base get certified for the year and a really strong bond offering. So we've been watching, I think, from the council side, bits and pieces of this that come in the news and in our conversations with the administration. And I felt like it was incumbent upon us in our kind of fiscal oversight role to get a more holistic update on where we are on all these fronts and have a chance to ask questions and have a chance for the public to kind of hear about the position that the city's in fiscally. So that's really the objective of today. We've also been joined by Councillor Julia Mejia at large and Councillor Ricardo Arroyo from District 5. So welcome to them. In the interest of really getting that presentation out there and making sure that Councillor time is spent on questions, I'm going to forego kind of just opening remarks and send us right to the administration's presentation, and then we'll go straight to colleague questions. So with that, I think we'll start with, we're joined here today by Emma Handy, who is the city's CFO and collector treasurer, Justin Sterrett, the director of our budget office, and Drew Smith, who's our treasurer, handles all the money. So we're really glad to have the full senior leadership team on the city's financial side join us today. And Chief Handy, I don't know if we should start with you or go straight to.
Sure. I'll just say briefly, thank you, Chairwoman Bach, for having us today. And nice to see you all, councilors. Glad we have this opportunity to touch base on the state of affairs for FY21 and talk a little bit about our use of federal CARES dollars. I am going to turn it right over to Justin Sterrett, our excellent budget director for the city of Boston. Drew Smith and I are available for questions, and we will be available as we move to councilor questions after Justin's presentation. So Justin, go ahead.
Thank you, Emma. I'm going to share my screen. Is that coming through for folks?
Yes. Right now we're seeing it in the context of the, yeah, exactly.
How's that? Great. Great. Thank you, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, councilors. Thank you for having us. As Emma mentioned, my name is Justin Sterrett. I'm the city's budget director. I'm going to run through this presentation and try to, obviously leave plenty of time for questions. Certainly echo all of Councilor Bach's comments around the city and the sort of challenges that we've seen and the uncertainty looking forward and looking forward to today's conversation about the city budget. So, before we get into sort of the update, I wanted to sort of set the table a little bit with a reminder of how we got to this point today. As you all remember, we were building the FY21 budget, actually very far along in building the FY21 budget when COVID hit last March. And that obviously, greatly impacted our thinking and sort of became an evolving part of topic, both from a revenue perspective, but also from a what are the new costs and what are the new sort of services that the city's going to have to stand up to respond to COVID-19. So it's definitely been a interesting year and one certainly unlike any other. At the time, we had sort of started to just see the fiscal impact on the revenue side of what COVID-19 was going to mean for the city budget. Taxes, especially excise taxes, are always collected in arrears. So basically, when we collect something in January, it's probably coming in for a month or two behind from what that actually time period was it was actually incurred by the business. So definitely started to see some of the impact initially in March and April. And then as we sort of got to building the budget in June and July and finalizing it, we started to make a pretty significant cut to what our expectations were for FY21 of about $65 million, or about 2% of the overall size of the budget. As you all know, obviously COVID-19 has continued to significantly impact the city and continues to have an effect to this day. And we're still seeing thousands of cases in the Commonwealth, hundreds in the city. And despite many sort of Herculean efforts by our public health department and medical community, it is still something that we will have with us for the sort of foreseeable future until widespread vaccination is adopted. So what that means on a city perspective is that the public health measures that have been put in place, whether it's around restaurant size or general activity in the city, that has continued to have a negative effect on our revenue beyond what we accounted for in the initial budget. The councilor touched on obviously hotels and meals, which continue to be sort of the two big areas of the budget which have suffered. I think meals less so than hotels. Meals have sort of leveled off, and frankly, thanks to our business community and thanks to our small businesses, have really done a good job of being creative and sort of generating more income for themselves, which in turn generates additional revenue to the city. Hotels are a slightly different story, where widespread tourist travel and widespread business travel for things like conventions and other forms of business have not picked up and have not returned in any meaningful way, and likely won't until not only vaccinations are complete in Massachusetts, but worldwide as well. So that is certainly an area that has continued to show weakness and will continue to show weakness likely into the foreseeable future. With that said, we did have new tools that were given to us, and thanks to the City Council for passing some of those back in March and April around federal funding related to FEMA and the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about today. We also saw really strong revenue growth in both the property tax side and some better than expected returns from state aid, thanks to our partners up on Beacon Hill. So I'll get into the specifics around those in a second. But we wanted to be clear and concise with the council and the public that the budget is balanced for FY21, and we do feel very strongly about going into the rest of the year. We had implemented several new fiscal controls with the help of the City Council at the beginning of the fiscal year, and had planned on extending those through the rest of the year. So this is stuff like the hiring freeze, suspending non-essential purchases, and the like. Going very recently, as we've continued to monitor our numbers, and we are confident that we are going to end the year in balance, we have started to ease some of those fiscal controls, especially around the hiring freeze, understanding that there are a lot of priorities, both within the administration, but also within the council, that were funded and protected in the FY21 budget. We want to make sure that those are up and running to support the services that residents need. So as I mentioned, we feel obviously very strongly about the sort of balanced nature of our budget, and as part of our tax rate setting process with the state that we go through every year with the help of obviously Drew and Emma, but also our collecting and assessing department, we recertify that the budget is balanced as part of that process with the state. Within that process, we do make adjustments to some of our assumptions around different revenue sources. So the most notably, and we'll talk about in a second, is overall these adjustments ended up being budget neutral and resulting in a balanced budget. So we were fortunate to see that. On the positive side, we saw about $49 million, or we're projecting about $49 million worth of additional property taxes on top of what we were anticipating as part of the adopted FY21 budget. primarily driven by new growth. Now, I want to pause for one quick second and talk a little bit about new growth. New growth is a backward-looking revenue source, like all property taxes are, and they look at taxes effective January 1st of the previous year. So for FY21, we're talking about January 1st, 2020. So we're really looking at calendar year 2019. At the time, obviously, the city and continues to be a hotbed for both development on the residential side as well as on the commercial side. In 2019 was a banner year for new growth in the city, topping $102 million. So that was a really exciting and really strong sign. It also doesn't take into account really anything that happened in calendar year 2020 so far. So that is both the any expected decline in economic activity related to development, whether it's on the commercial side or the housing side caused by COVID-19, nor does it take into account the construction pause implemented by the mayor back in March through May, which paused construction in the city. Obviously it eventually reopened safely thanks to some work with the Public Health Commission. But that type of effect where we sort of have paused construction will have an effect on new growth, not in this fiscal year, but actually the upcoming fiscal year, FY22 and beyond, where we will sort of start to see some of the effects of either the sort of pause on construction as well as any changes to the broader real estate development market. So that was good news on the property tax side. In addition, on the state aid side, obviously many of you know that the state did not finalize their budget until late into calendar year 2020. And when the numbers shook out after that was complete, we ended up with a $9 million increase in our net state aid, which is the amount of funding coming back to support schools and government services. So that was a positive. On the negative side, we did see, and we are projecting about a $57 million decrease in anticipated local revenue. So these are things like excise taxes, like we've mentioned at length today, as well as departmental revenue. And these are things like fines and permits. We're just seeing less economic activity in the city and less people in the city coming into work, obviously. So that's having an effect on both fines and the permits that we're putting out there. Again, obviously those are sort of driven by COVID-19. And if folks remember, we anticipated sort of a slow opening of the economy as COVID-19 got under wraps. And that is something we've started to see in certain areas and certainly something that we're hopeful to look for into future fiscal years. But based on our current projections from the state and from our own analysis, we see a decrease in expected local revenue, now offset by an increase in property taxes and state aid, which means we have a balanced budget going into the rest of this fiscal year. So moving on beyond the sort of the 21 budget update, we wanted to spend some time talking about the Coronavirus Relief Fund. As many of you know, the city being a population over 500,000 was eligible to apply directly to the federal government for something called the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which thanks to the council, we accepted back in March of 2020. This grant for $121 million had very specific criteria that it needed to be used for. It could not be used for revenue replacement. It could not be used for non-COVID related activities. And there was an original deadline of December 30, 2020. Congress did not give us any more money, but they did extend the time frame by which we were able to use the money, which allowed us to extend some programs through the rest of this fiscal year, which we'll talk a little bit more about. The table you see in front of you is what we have budgeted for each of the different categories of expenses that are eligible within the CRF grant program. And I'm going to talk specifically about what each of these buckets of funding were spent on. You will see we do have a very small amount of funding left over that we're terming emergency funding. This is funding to be used on direct COVID related expenses that are likely and sort of almost assured to pop up within the next 12 months. Think of this as our pot of money that if we were to say have to stand up the Boston Hope or another sort of emergency type program, depending on the path of the virus, this is the pot of money that we would be utilizing. And it's obviously relatively small at this point. So definitely something to keep in mind, but we did want to give a little bit of a retrospective of what we've spent the remainder of the $121 million on so far. So Starting with city expenses, this is a relatively broad category, but think of this as everything within City Hall or everything within sort of the purview of city departments. We've allocated about $33 million, or about 27% of the grant, towards those city services. And this is paying for things like PPE for city employees and frontline responders. This is where we fund food delivery and service programs for vulnerable residents through our Office of Food Access, our Age Strong Commission, our Office of Immigrant Advancement, working closely with them and local food pantries to stand up programs for vulnerable residents. That's where this funding has come from. Personnel and staff responding to COVID-19, cleaning and disinfecting of public areas and city facilities, technology assistance to help mitigate the COVID-19 threats, both from a city perspective, so enabling telework. I think a lot of credit goes to the city. We are one of, if not the only city in the Commonwealth who remained fully operational throughout the entire COVID-19 pandemic, and the funding that this grant helped facilitate really allowed us to do so. So big shout out to our operations and workforce teams who have really worked seamlessly through this process to make sure we're still providing those vital city services that residents are relying on. And then finally, public health and medical expenditures outside of what I'll talk about in a second, which is the grant funding we provided directly to the Health Commission for things like Boston Hope and the like. So moving on to public health side of our expenditures, we set aside about $20 million directly to the Boston Public Health Commission. And this is funding programs like testing and contract tracing. So you'll see that we talk a lot about different testing that we've stood up either through or in partnership with our community health centers, but as well as the mobile testing that we're doing in different neighborhoods throughout the year. That's where this funding came from. We're also obviously in the process of standing up and staffing vaccine clinics, both the big ones at the RCC, as well as different community ones we'll be standing up over the next couple months. Work around disease containment, quarantining and isolating for affected individuals, communication and community engagement supports, as well as workforce and PPE directly for the Boston Public Health Commission. I do want to note that this $20 million is in addition to their $100 million operating budget that the city provides, as well as direct FEMA funding that BPHC is pursuing outside of the $20 million that they have here in the tens of millions of dollars. Next, we have the Boston Public Schools. Obviously, this is the biggest part of our budget, so it obviously represents a very large portion of our CRF funding. At the end of the day, we provided about $23 million, or about a little short of 20% on that grant. And this is both to provide sort of the robust at-home learning that we've provided, so Chromebooks, Wi-Fi, technology supports for staff and students, as well as additional summer sessions targeted at learning loss. And then a considerable amount of investment in facility improvements, both in ventilation systems and windows and making sure our buildings are up to speed, but also new equipment like air purifiers and testers to be deployed once school gets fully back up and running in the coming months to make sure that both staff and students are safe when they're entering the building. So that represented a very large portion of that funding. I do also want to note again that this is in addition to the $1.2 billion annual operating budget that the city provides to BPS, as well as in addition to the $100 million plus federal funding that is going directly to the school department to be used for both mitigating COVID-19, but as well as preparing for the recovery that will come post COVID-19. So this is all in addition to all that funding. The next I want to touch on very quickly is economic development. The city has been fortunate to stand up many grant programs to target very hard-hit businesses in Boston. And this funding, about $23 million, or about 20% of the grant, went directly towards standing up and funding those programs. This includes the Small Business Relief Fund, which has provided over nearly 2,000 grants of $2,500, $5,000, and $10,000 to different businesses. The Reopen Boston Fund, which has provided PPE grants and support for restaurants opening up outdoor seating. Commercial rent relief for our hardest hit industries, especially neighborhood business centers and main streets. A certified business program, which has provided grants directly to minority and women-owned businesses of up to $15,000. Art grants. Art grants is certainly an area that we focus very closely with the Executive Office of Arts and Culture for the city, as well as working with our local business leaders. They are disproportionately being hit by this right now, given that many of them cannot be in person. So we're able to stand up arts grants, an art grant fund to support over 140 artists. And then finally, direct support for our tourism industry, as well as restaurants, to make sure that, when it is safe to reopen and when it is safe to have people back to Boston, we are ready and able to do so. Tourism and restaurants are not only the lifeblood of our small businesses, but our economy here in Boston. They also represent a significant tax base for the city that we want to support. So any dollar we spend here is going to more than come back to us in tax revenue for the city that we can then use to fund all the other types of programs that the city cares about. So the last one, and I promise this is where I'll stop talking and open it up for any questions you have, is around housing and homelessness. So we spent about $12 million, or about 10% of the funding, on funding for the rental relief program that we have stood up, as well as for emergency shelter and de-densification services through the new Chardon Street facility that was opened very recently to help de-densify some of our homeless shelters and get folks housed during this process. And while it's a relatively small portion, 12 million or 10% of the funds, I should also note that this is in addition to, thanks to the council's support, the $40 million of direct funding that D&D has also received to support housing, as well as federal and state programs that have been stood up around rental relief. So it's a smaller portion of our overall grant, but it is not a reflection of the resources totally, because there are other federal funding that is going directly to D&D and our community providers to help provide rent relief, working with tenants, working with homeowners as they sort of also grapple with COVID-19. So with that, I will stop, and I think Emma, Drew, and myself would be happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin. I'm going to start off and then go to colleagues. And just so colleagues know, the order of arrival is Councillor Flynn, Braden, O'Malley, Campbell, Wu, Mejia, Arroyo, and Flaherty. We were joined right at the start of the presentation by Councillor Michael Flaherty at large. So that'll be the order, and I'll just start. So I guess a first question, Justin, just to sort of clarify, because I'm trying to make sure I have a sense of all the buckets of money. In terms of departments of the city that got direct CARES fund, in addition to the 120 that we authorized, there's the 40 for D&D, and that's specific COVID-related emergency money separate from their normal HUD grants.
Yeah, so this is, I believe it came in as a
couple of things, right?
CDBG block formula grant, but yes, it's in addition to their regular money.
Right, and how much of that? Obviously, the council's voted through a few appropriations of that. And I think a decent amount's been used for rental relief. But like, do you have a sense, and it's fine if this is a follow-up after, but kind of what proportion of D&D's funds in that bucket have been like committed versus are kind of still sitting to be committed?
I'll have to follow up with you on the specifics. I would say we are prioritizing using the CRF first, because that is the one which has the soonest deadline of expiring. So that expires at the end of 2021, whereas CDBG, as well as some of the other grants to schools and public health and the like, have longer timeframes for use. But I'll have to get specifics for you on how much is left of the 40 million.
Okay, and then the schools, I know that there was a significant grant for the schools. I think you said, what was the number? It's north of $100 million in the bill that passed right at the end of the year.
Yes, I believe in total, the schools department has received about $120 million of federal funding. 20 million was in the original bucket back in 25 million was back in the original bucket, which has been used for school efforts this year, as well as the new funding that came in at the end of December. I think it's around 120 million.
Okay. And that has not yet, I mean, that's meant to be sort of for longer term recovery for the schools?
Yeah, so I believe the time frame on that, and again, would defer to the school department, is about 2 or 3 years. So they'll have a little bit of a runway to spend that on both, responding directly to COVID, but then also starting to plan for what an equitable recovery looks like. How do we deal with learning loss? How do we deal with, the social emotional issues and the trauma, frankly, that COVID has brought on, and that is sort of a forward-looking 22 and beyond conversation.
Yeah, no, I just want to flag that I think for the council, obviously we don't have sort of direct power over that money in the same way because of the way it runs through the school committee. But I think it will be important as we're talking about the school budget this spring to be talking in a coordinated way in concert about how that money is going to address that need, because it's definitely, you know, the need that's on everybody's lips right now. We all see it. And then I just wondered if you could speak a little bit too, and I know, you know, we're talking right now about birds in the hand, but obviously a challenge throughout COVID has been not getting revenue replacement support at the federal level for cities and states. And I know that is a component of the $1.9 trillion package. And now that that's actually like gone through on both sides of the you know, it seems like a more going concern. I did sort of want to ask you what the scale of that support, if it came through, would be like for the city of Boston.
Sure. I echo your sentiment around birds in the hand, two in the bush. We were definitely left waiting at the altar, I'll use a different expression, when the last bill came through. And that actually had state and city support passed through both the House and the Senate, and it fell out in the conference committee. But with that said, I think we are very optimistic, thanks to the Biden administration, Biden-Harris administration, as well as support on both sides of Congress for a significant new round of funding for localities. Some of the estimates that have come out so far are in the hundreds of millions of dollars of new funding that could come back to the city, which I think would be a game changer, and is certainly an area where we look forward to sort of a robust conversation, you know, around our 22 budget process, but as well as, you know, how do we build an equitable recovery? How do we invest in the areas that are most hardest hit right now? And that type of funding will be the sort of linchpin to get that done. We are still, you know, dealing with the effects of COVID-19. We will be dealing with property tax and changes in the property tax in the development community for years to come. And that type of funding will help not only shore up our finances, but also help us set the stage for new investments or investments in getting back to where we were, and sort of pushing the ball forward in so many areas going forward.
Yeah. No, I mean, obviously that would be a huge, I mean, yeah, north of 200, 300, something. I mean, it would be very helpful to us. I wondered if you could just speak, one more question for you and then one for Drew, and I want to go to colleagues. So in terms of the FEMA funding, I understand that to be a reimbursement process. So what's tricky about that, right, is how much, on the one hand, I think there are categories that the White House has in theory opened up to 100% reimbursement now, which feels like the sky should be the limit. On the other hand, obviously, like if we do something and then wait to find out whether they're going to reimburse us, there's some real exposure there. So I'm just trying to understand, when we talk about FEMA dollars, it's weird. We're not approving any appropriations. It's not coming to us as a grant. Like how should we think about, like, is that we're going to end up getting 25 million from FEMA when the dust settles? Is it also in the hundreds of millions? Like, what is the FEMA world look like?
It's a good question. And frankly, I think there's been so much evolving guidance on it, both coming from a previous administration where it wasn't looked at as the sort of tool that everyone, I think, hoped it would be. Whereas I think with the Biden administration, they have certainly opened it up for 100% reimbursement, but also added categories. So I don't think it's in the hundreds of millions. I think when it's all said and done, our goal is going to be to maximize FEMA. It's going to be to maximize CARES. It's going to be to maximize how much funding we can get back to the city. But you're right. We are at risk if we stand up programs and do new things, and all of a sudden it gets kicked back to us as either ineligible, which then either is coming out of the city budget, or it's coming out of CARES, or it's coming out of some other source. And that's all the process that we're working through right now. We are working with the state, with a consultant that they brought on to help manage our submittals to FEMA. So we are working closely with them to try to both maximize what we can get out of FEMA, as well as make sure we're documenting everything. It is a much more let's call it robust process of reporting with FEMA and approvals outside of the CARES Act, which has been a much more streamlined and much more I think honestly effective tool, because it's allowed us to move quickly, stand up new programs, be responsive to what the needs are in the community.
Got it. Yeah, it would be good to get some understanding. I understand it's a moving target, but of kind of what we're looking at, since obviously it's a big delta potentially for the city of funding available. My last question actually for Drew, and Drew, not to put you on the spot a little bit, because I know Justin was the presenter today, but I just wonder if you could speak a little bit to sort of, when people thinking about the public and counselors, watching this, when people see the kind of ups and downs that our economy has been through over the last year, thinking about the impact for the city in terms of both that despite the fact that we're in this recession, we continue to have a pretty favorable debt environment and kind of what that's meant for us. And then also just because my colleagues know, like, if rarely does a council meeting go by where I don't suggest that we do more capital spending and as a countercyclical tool. But also if you could just speak a little bit to the extent to which the city is exposed to the changes in the market, in commodities, and kind of like where we've landed with all of that, like what the city's investment situation looks like, just so people know like where we've come out through this storm so far.
Well, our investment situation is good. Certainly what we have invested in the OPEB trust has gone positive with the market. I think what's more important than just market returns is the fact that we do fund an OPEB trust. Not everyone does. So that's important. I won't be able to speak to the pension situation. That would be a different area, but I will say that the rating agencies understand that we take our pension obligation very seriously. That's something that finds its way into the broader market when we go out to sell bonds. They also understand that to be the case, and that's important, and it helps keep our borrowing costs down. Again, what's important there is not just the rate of return on the investments, but also a seriousness about maintaining our pension schedule and making sure that we fund that ahead of time. I think from a ratings perspective, while we, like all cities, face a certain amount of difficulty with respect to what's going on with the pandemic, I think we have a good story around the relative stability of our primary revenue source, which is property taxes. And that's something that the rating agencies and by extension, the investors take a look at when they're purchasing our debt. So from generally an investment perspective, we're doing great. Obviously, when we talk about cash investment, we're largely at the mercy of the market and where money market rates are and short-term deposits are. So that certainly has gone down, and it's something that we continue not necessarily to try to beat the market. We just try to get a good market rate while keeping that money safe. And we've got a number of initiatives built in there that I'm certain you've all heard about, and we can certainly talk about in the future. But does that answer your question? I'm happy to expound on any of that.
Yeah, no, that's all helpful. And just, yeah, we don't need to go into it in depth, but just I know that there was a significant bond offering that you all did in December. Sure. That is sort of part of FY21, because obviously we authorized that in our capital budget.
Well, and I'll say that, the low rates may hurt us on the investment side, or not hurt us, but may take away from us on the investment side. But when we're going to place bonds, it's one of the reasons that we were able to offer or achieve the lowest true interest cost of any offering the city's experienced in its history at 1.23%. So, those are savings that we'll experience over the next 20 years as we continue to pay those bonds off. So it was a significant deal. It was a complex deal. It generated over $11 million in debt service savings, in addition to significant amount of proceeds at a pretty cheap cost. So.
And was that, I know that we had a significant savings programmed in from that one-time change in timing, but I remember that being part of the package of savings that we were, but is that distinct from the 11 million you're talking
Yes.
about?
Yep.
Okay.
And really what we're going to do with the bond transaction, what we're planning on doing. So traditionally we've been on a spring schedule where we go out with a new money offering in the spring. We wanted to push the deal back partly because of the pandemic. It had a lot of the markets frozen. AAA deals were still getting done, but we just didn't want to chance it, and we didn't have to. So we decided to delay that. Turned out to be good programmatically because we are most likely going to stay on a fall schedule. So instead of going back to the market every spring, we're going to start doing the fall for a while. That'll help diversify some of our debt holdings or debt issuances. But one of the positive benefits of that was we were able to forgo adding a new principal payment. Those are significant in a single fiscal year. So that would have been pushed off.
Got it. Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go now to colleagues. So I think the first was Councillor Flynn. Councillor Flynn, you have the floor, and I'll do my usual I'll keep a timer and we'll reach up my gavel when we're getting there, and then let the timer go off if folks really run over. So just because I know we do have a lot of colleagues on the line and I want to move through people's questions. So Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. Thank you, Emma, Justin, and Drew, for the important work you and your team are doing during this difficult period. I know as we face these unprecedented times, and with the economy greatly impacted by the pandemic, the fiscal health of our city is extremely critical, as we need to ensure that our residents are still receiving the services and resources they need during this pandemic. I recently sponsored a hearing with residents of Boston. It was chaired by Councilor Buck on property taxes. Certainly property taxes went up. Our city relies heavily on property taxes of residents and business owners as well. I guess my question is, as we go forward, whether it's this year's budget or next year's budget, are we looking at a certain cut in services, a certain cut in capital projects? And do you envision that we'll continue, property taxes going up, and also with the economy in a recession, a lot of businesses are struggling to pay that property tax as well. I've heard from many businesses in my district, especially in the downtown area. But having factored all of those issues in, what are you thinking in terms of additional revenue, potential cuts in critical services?
I can take a stab at that first and then pass it to Justin. Thank you, Councillor Flynn, for the question. I'll take first the point about property taxes, because I know this year was a notable year for residents and property taxes. The dynamics in 21, the current fiscal year, were really about a 5-year revaluation that's required by state law. We were in our 5th year, and so we're required to do that for all properties. And so what most homeowners experienced is actually a shift in what their overall value was of their home, and therefore a change in their tax bill. It was not really related to the overall economic and budget factors at play in the city of Boston, but rather sort of about the formula that drives our property taxes in terms of basically city spending over value. And we are required to set those values every year. We are required to sort of reset them every 5 years, or at least no greater than every 5 years from the Department of Revenue. And so that work happened this year by the Department of Assessing, and did impact many homeowners' tax bills in terms of what they had typically experienced. On the question of sort of what factors are we looking at for property taxes and sort of the overall stability of the budget in 21 and 22, I will say at a high level, and then pass it to Justin, that for many years, the city talked about our concern about our over-reliance on property taxes. And I do think, moving into the future, that continues to be something that we should, all be, I think, concerned about and interested in. Sort of, are there dynamics at play that we might want to revisit what our overall revenue mix is? That being said, the 70+% of our budget that is reliant on property taxes has, to some extent, shielded us somewhat from the vulnerability that other major cities have seen in their tax bases, and therefore, layoffs and dramatic budget reductions that they've had to implement mid-year to adjust for the COVID revenue dynamics. So we have certainly seen revenue loss in our excise taxes, as Justin mentioned, and some of our departmental revenue. But by and large, because over 70% of our tax space is property taxes, and that is generally increasing by 2.5%. We have been able to continue core critical city services, avoid layoffs through simply tightening our belts and really being careful about how we're spending, and with the addition of federal funding. The federal funding has absolutely been essential. And that has meant that through 21, we've been able to manage without having to make some of those dramatic service cuts that you're seeing in other places. And we hope that that's the case for 22 as well. We are still obviously working through what our blueprint looks like for 22, and we need more information about what that federal relief will look like as well. Justin, what would you add?
The only thing I would add, and just to jump on your comment around the capital side, Councilor, and we working closely with the council, through last year's budget process, that became a top priority to protect, and frankly, it's paying dividends right now. We are not only on pace to have the most spending on the capital side in any single fiscal year for this year, it's a reflection of continuing to push the needle on making the city capital plan, which is now the most bold and aggressive capital plan in the city's history, and we sort of hope and prioritize keeping that forward going into 22. It also has allowed us to do more innovative things and invest more in for the first time in green bonds and social bonds, and we're all doing that at a time when we're sort of every other city in the country is pulling back, and that's really a reflection of the core commitment on the operating budget side to make sure we're living within our means and making sure that we're funding our pensions and funding our OPEB. So I really do think that at a time when most other cities are pulling back on the capital side, we're pushing the needle even forward, thanks to the good collaboration with the council on that.
Thank you. And I just have one follow-up question. I know Boston in the mid 80s was able to get the jet fuel tax and the hotel motel tax through the legislature. But is there any other possible ways or to consider raising revenues that won't hurt residents? Is there any other options out there that you're currently thinking about that might make sense, whether it's today or years down the road, of how we can raise additional revenue?
Councilor, I think, certainly you can look at what other major cities have for tax bases. As I mentioned, we really are reliant on property taxes. Other cities have, portions of income tax. They have a penny of the sales tax or whatever it may be. Some places have things like, alcohol taxes or soda taxes or things like that. Those are all things that, certainly other major cities have adopted to enhance their revenue streams. All of those things require the same type of process for us, which includes, state house approval. Unfortunately, we cannot unilaterally through mayoral and council partnership enact those things, but they're certainly worthy of a conversation and consideration, despite the fact that they do have, a procedural process that we're required to go through to advance them.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Drew. And I know the city is in good fiscal hands with the dedicated and professional budget team. So just want to say thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you, Councilor Bock.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. Councilor Braden?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question with regard to our pilot payments. We all understand it's been a really tremendous upheaval in our, especially in our education sector with our universities. Since this public health crisis has been going on now since January of 2020, I'm just curious to know how the pilot payments are coming in and if we are meeting the expected targets that we had. The expected targets. That's the question. Thank you.
I'll answer the math side, and then Emma, Drew, feel free to jump in. I think when we looked at the end of fiscal year 20, which was the end of the last sort of the most recent data we have from a final perspective, we came in pretty close to what we were expecting. There's two types of pilots, as you all know. The pilots that we get from our voluntary contributions from our meds, our eds, and our nonprofit institutions is one bucket. And the other bucket of pilot is what we get from the state and Massport for their property that they own in the city. The state and Massport portion came in on target. The Ed's, the other portion of the pilot with our institutions came in slightly below where we were, but for the most part, most of them contributed at similar levels. I wouldn't speculate too much into the rest of this year into next year, because that's, I think, a conversation that I think they're all having internally, and it's going to be sort of a more robust community conversation going forward.
Thank you. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Braden. Councillor O'Malley? Oh, you know what, Councillor O'Malley, just he was here with Margot and just had to step away. So going next to Councillor Wu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you so much to the administration for all of what you've been doing over the last year, and today's presentation, of course. You've mentioned this in a couple of places already, but could you just dive into the staffing and sort of municipal workforce projections over the next 2 upcoming fiscal years, and what that looks like? I know I think Justin had said earlier in the initial presentation that you're taking off hiring freezes, but could you just walk through what you anticipate, relative to, let's say, this moment right now, as well as relative to pre-COVID? What will the staffing levels likely look like, given our budgets in the next 2 fiscal years?
Sure. I'll do the budgeted staffing to date, and then I'll either turn it over to Emma to think broader around the future. So to date in the budget, we added about 200 positions in this last FY21 budget. Obviously, the hiring freeze and COVID has affected the pace of filling those positions, both within the city, but then also the school department. But from a budgeting perspective, we're up about 200, 230, I think, positions between 20 and 21. I think looking forward, there's going to be certainly needs and demands that I think are going to require certain staffing in increases in certain areas. Schools comes to mind. Obviously, public health comes to mind. I think that that's going to be part of the sort of deliberative process we go through as we build the 22 budget and beyond, but I could certainly see demands for those. I would say from a sourcing perspective, it's going to come down to the federal relief that comes through. We are sort of not out of the woods from a financial point of view when we start to think about 22 and beyond, and federal relief is going to be vital to not only sort of shoring up our budget going forward, but also making the type of investments that I think everyone wants, and from a staffing perspective. So I think that those two unknowns and those two, forward-looking ideas are really going to be dictated by what we get from the federal government.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor, for the question. I would just add, in terms of FY22, we are still sort of working with departments to understand what their sort of aspirational or investment needs are for the next fiscal year. And those would include the types of things that are, sort of headcount or personnel responsive to the new reality that we're living in. I think to Justin's point, we need to do a little work internally to figure out what the right source is to fund something like that, right? Because we're trying to figure out how to sort of afford things within the envelope of the sort of perennial city budget and balance the federal resources that are intended to help us both, sort of answer the need for COVID and also recover from COVID as a city. The only other thing I would add is just that, obviously our general approach to headcount over the years has been very targeted. We don't typically add a whole lot of headcount sort of across the board in city departments. In past years where we have added headcount, it has been one of sort of the signature investments of each budget. So, things like an additional EMT truck in East Boston, or a police class, or the family liaisons at BPS in FY21. And so, headcount typically grows because we have one of those sort of concerted efforts in a particular department, and not so much because of sort of general increases to headcount. I think that's still true in terms of how we would make these decisions moving into 22 and beyond, because we'd be looking for sort of how does this headcount help you respond to the moment. So nothing about sort of our decision making would change, although of course everything has changed about what the city is doing and how we're doing it. And so I think that will filter into sort of what the investments are that we present to you when we come in April.
So I guess just for one level of clarity, I know there's so much up in the air, of course, and that a lot of it revolves around the federal government. So what do just in terms of pure, are we at a point where we have to be thinking about tightening, holding the freezes, or even more than that, if X amount of what we're hoping for from the federal government doesn't come through, or if none of it comes through, or
Yeah.
what is reasonable? How are you making those projections?
So I will say, right, we did just loosen some of the hiring freezes, and that was really because we got this additional extension of CARES. So it does go hand in hand with the federal resources in terms of our ability to be flexible and nimble. I think it would have been a tougher fiscal year to land in 21 if we didn't have an additional flexibility to apply some of that CARES funding through this calendar year. And so, we anticipate that we will have moderate revenue growth next year because of, again, our sort of what the dynamics are at play in terms of what our revenue base is. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet. We're still waiting for information in part from the state on some of the excise taxes and things like that. So there are a number of mitigating factors. I think it has been a priority to maintain headcount and not have to pursue layoffs. And I think that will continue to be, our general approach. Obviously, we have to make the numbers balance. And so to the extent that we do not receive new federal resources, which again, I hope is unlikely at this point, but or that something dramatically shifts around excise taxes. Every time we've reforecasted these, we've reforecasted a period in which we think things are going to start to get better. And unfortunately, every time we've done that, we've had to push that date out because it's been longer than we had anticipated at the time. So those things, exactly as you said, Counselor, federal aid, the sort of accuracy of our projections as we try to look into a crystal ball that nobody knows the answer to, are the things that we would sort of have to contingency plan for if they did not end up coming true. But again, I think maintaining the city's workforce, particularly given how essential the workforce has been in terms of response to our residents in COVID, is absolutely a priority of ours.
Okay, and then do I have time for half a question more, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Okay. So just thinking, I know my time limits. Just thinking about the shift from emergency relief to kind of getting in some ways back to the pattern rhythms of basic city services, which I know have been ongoing this whole time, but as more people are out and about, as there's more foot traffic again, and trash pickup and this and that, and small businesses needing direct attention, the numbers and the flux, how are you thinking about at what point the sort of return to making sure all those rhythms of people being out and about and all the direct service needs that results in will be balanced?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, depending on the department and the type of work, we're sort of at different points in where the workforce is. Most of our sort of direct service departments are largely back to sort of the work shift realities that they had before COVID, obviously with social distancing and PPE and lots of COVID safety protocols in place. There's all sorts of things around spacing in vehicles and things like that we've adopted. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had done a lot of things like split shifts and just sort of in general trying to space people out. And we have largely moved backwards into sort of full implementation really of how people were sort of operating beforehand, again, with all the protocols in place for safety. I do think there are some exceptions to that. I can't think of exactly which ones they are off the top of my head. Our goal has been in managing the sort of workforce and operations across the city through this COVID lens has been always making sure that people that can work from home are allowed to and able to work from home, and that people that have to be somewhere in person to do their work are doing so in an environment that is as safe as possible through PPE, social distancing, hand washing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that we are all learning together about what that time horizon looks like in terms of when some of those things might be loosened. So we are, just now starting to talk about occupancy levels as they start, the state starts to conceptualize increasing those again, what that will look like for our office buildings and things like that. But it's all tied together with vaccine rollout and everything else that I think it sort of hangs together in terms of our thinking. So I don't have a great answer for you on, it's this month or that month. But this is the constant push and pull we're sort of juggling as we return services back to online through a centralized process within the A&F and operations cabinet.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wu. Councillor Arroyo.
Thank you so much. Just kind of picking up on some of Councillor Wu's questions there about the hiring. I know that there was that release that we actually added jobs this year. I believe, Mr. Starter, you cited the number was, or they did, but either way, it was like somewhere around 300 jobs got added. Is that about accurate?
I think about 230, of which I believe 200 came directly from the school department.
Okay, and so how much of that is related to CARES money? How many of those jobs are actually funded by CARES money and not by, the original city budget?
I don't believe any of them are funded directly from CARES. There may be portions of the salaries that are directly related to COVID response that may be moved over to the CARES Act grant eventually, but the city budget funded those positions fully.
And do we know if those positions are as currently offered and accepted and folks are working them as permanent positions, or are those considered temporary positions to make up for certain things, or are those all full employment positions?
All full employment positions. I think Emma touched on the biggest one of them with the investments in social emotional learning at schools, which is a new liaison and new counselors. So those are all full-time permanent positions.
Okay, and so when we're looking at this next fiscal budget, and we're looking at shortages in terms of how we're doing this, do we know, and I know this is a little bit in advance, we're talking about fiscal year 2021, but do we have any idea what we're looking at for fiscal 2022? Do we know if we're, for instance, and here's why I'm asking, if we're in a position where we have to sort of look at jobs and look at where we're making cuts, are we able to kind of move in a way in fiscal year 2021 where we lessen the burden in 2022? Or is this a situation where we don't have enough of a grasp on what those numbers will look like in 2022, so we just have to work with what we have right now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The interesting thing when you think about 22, right, the budget's going to go up, right? Property taxes, are slated to rise as they have every year for 30 years. I mean, I go back to Councillor Wu's question. When we start seeing those restaurants with activity, not only is that great for those businesses, but that's good for the city's coffers as well. So the more we can encourage economic activity. With that said, though, our pension is going to go up based on the pension schedule, which is about 8%. Our debt service is going to go up to support the capital plan, which is 5 or 6%, something like that. That's more percentage-wise than the rest of the revenue that is coming in will probably grow. So there will be trade-offs, and there will be certainly belt tightening, and we are instructing departments to look for efficiencies and look for savings. I do agree with Emma that I think layoffs or reductions in staff is going to be the last line that we would have to draw going into 2022.
Yeah, and I would probably hope that is true, that's the last line across. But as we look at 2021 specifically, do we know? I know we're looking at projections. Do we know by, say, May how firm those projections will be?
We'll have, the thing that's different about this sort of recession and this sort of economic downturn is it's unlike anything else, right? It's all based on public health changes. So, I think we'll have a good sense of what the new normal, quote unquote, new normal is based on COVID, but certainly by May and certainly with the 22 budget. With that said, if there was sort of another shutdown or there was something else, that's what it's hard for us to predict and why we have to be a little bit nimble when it comes to thinking about next year.
Understandable, we're in the same place.
Sorry, I was just going to add that I think your question is a great one, and the thing that's sort of behind it is that so much, basically, what we spend money on as a city government are these basic city services, and that is headcount, right? How we provide basic city services is through city employees, and so to Justin's point around increased pressure on our fixed responsibilities and long-term planning, things like OPEB and pension that we need to pay for. Unfortunately, right, the sort of spending side of the equation is really the departments deliver through employees, and our employees have been incredible through COVID-19. They have showed up for our city residents and our city businesses in an amazing way. And that's part of the reason why, because we've needed them so badly, that we've really done all that we can through tightening. And I think Justin's team has really looked at every bucket that they could to find the savings so that it didn't affect our employees and the work that they do on behalf of our residents and our businesses. So, but that at the end of the day, that is kind of our budget, right? Is city employees, and so that is where the spending goes.
I would agree with that. I would also add that my larger concern is, even as we're cutting these things, we're going to be looking at a school budget where this is an unprecedented situation for our students, for our teachers. I have to imagine that there's a number of resources we're going to have to invest in that we just have never invested in before. In the investments that we've made in the past, we should be stepping up greatly, and I'm not sure we have the resources to do those things. And so, do we know, either through the state or through CARES or through some legislation that may be discussed at the federal level or pending or anything like that, what we're looking at for a school budget? Because my concern was we essentially passed what worked out to be the exact same school budget pre-COVID as we did post-COVID. And I just don't think we can do that this year. I think we need to make real investments in a real way, higher than we normally do. And so, knowing that, are there any other resources that we're looking at, whether it's state, which I don't know what's there. I'm frankly not sure anything is there. Federal government, or anything where we can actually get some more resources without having to take from our actual city works, our city departments that aren't BPS related.
As two former state budget people, we're happy to go up to Beacon Hill with you to ask for more money anytime, Counselor. With that said, I mean, I think the school committee, or the superintendent, presented her budget to the school committee last week, and I think we're proud, and I think frankly it's pretty historic. You know, obviously working with the council, that we're able to functionally support a increased level of funding for the school department, both in 21, like you mentioned, but also 22. You know, in line with the Mayor Walsh's commitment around $100 million over 3 years. We're probably the only school in the country who's increasing their own local revenue, or the only major school district in the country who's doing that. And I think that that's a testament to, you know, a lot of the work that we've done sort of collectively to tighten our belts and prioritize those investments. With that said, I could not agree more that new resources are going to be needed, and new resources are going to be needed now, basically, you know, as we're sort of getting closer. And I think that that's going to be a little bit dependent on, you know, what BPS has received already through the federal government. You know, I mentioned at the beginning about $119 million, $120 million in new funding that we can program. But then also, who do we advocate for? How do we advocate for additional resources to do a multi-year planning? The big secret with ERA money back in 2009 was that it provided a whole bunch of new money for cities and towns and the state, but then it went away. So how do we sort of build a structure going forward that in 3 or 4 years, when the CARES money goes away, we actually have those positions fully funded in the budget and fully supported, so that there isn't a big fiscal cliff? And I think that it's going to be an evolving conversation going forward.
Well, I appreciate your efforts, both of you, on that. And just my final question, because it might be a quick one, is just, do we know what the percentage of increase on that BPS proposed budget is from last fiscal year?
Ooh, you're putting me on the spot.
If you don't, it's fine.
It's a $36 million increase. So my rough math says about a 3% increase.
Okay, thank you. That's better at math than me. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to you both for the work you're doing in really difficult conditions.
Thank you so much, Councilor Arroyo. And Justin, is that, because the 36 million is the sort of new investment stuff, what about kind of like the built-in like fixed cost increases? I know last year it was like we were looking at like 80 overall, and then 33 of it was like the kind of new.
Yeah, great question. We haven't sort of, the biggest fixed cost at BPS, much like it is at the city, is headcount. And, you know, we're entering a place where we had a settled contract for FY21, where we do not have a settled contract for FY22. So much of those additional increases, if there are any, would sort of need to be worked out through the collective bargaining process, and that is not settled yet.
Got it. Okay, so there isn't that large additional delta for this year yet. Got it. Okay. I think we've run through all the colleagues. I had a few colleagues who, Councillor Flaherty, Councillor Mejia, both wanted me to thank you for the clear presentation, and said that their questions have been asked by colleagues. I had a couple more, and then I know we've also got a little bit of public testimony. I wondered, Justin, if you could speak to, in terms of what the kind of net impact of the hiring freeze was, like how many of, I'm just thinking about the new positions that the council funded. Like you say, most of them were over on the school side. And then I remember very much the parks, we were looking at new arborists, urban forestry stuff, like kind of which of those things can we expect to at least be hired, although we won't have spent as much money on them over the course of the year because it's delayed by the end of the fiscal year, given the delay in the process.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll take the investment side first. I think throughout even the hiring freeze was for non-vital public health related positions. There were a bunch of investments, especially through the BPHC, the school department, and City Hall, that are vital new positions. So we did move those forward as part of the hiring process. I think you're right. There are certainly some positions that were frozen, that were new or existing positions that now that the freeze has been lessened, has been softened, we'll sort of begin in earnest the process of recruiting and hiring. I think one of the biggest areas that is going to dictate how quickly we'll get back to what I'll quote unquote call full employment for the city is really the public health side. Some departments don't necessarily need as many people because they're serving less people because of the pandemic. So we're really going to try to sort of stagger filling those positions as the demands for those services return, right? A great example is if a pool is closed because of COVID-19, we don't necessarily need to hire that lifeguard today. We can hire that lifeguard sort of a month in advance of when we need that pool is going to sort of safely reopen.
And were those savings, I'm just thinking about the fact that we, in the numbers you threw up, right, revenue side, we've sort of netted out even because we lost the 57 million in excises and department fines and fees, but we gained it on the state aid and an unexpected property tax, especially new growth side. But I'm just wondering if obviously we put in the modified budget in June, we put into place the hiring freeze expectation for the first half of the year as a way to help control costs. But I'm just wondering if you guys were fully able to anticipate those roles that weren't going to turn out to be useful, or just whether we've also achieved savings that maybe aren't being articulated on the balance sheet from the things like the lifeguards.
Yeah, I would say for the most part, we've sort of fully realized the 6 months of savings that we had in place. So those are kind of baked into departmental budgets already by just having less money in them. Any additional savings that, maybe a person here or a person there, that'll sort of help offset, which has been a historic and big thanks goes out to the Public Works Department. It's been a really snowy last couple of weeks. So, we may be looking at a snow budget that might be slightly out of balance, or might be, in excess of what we appropriated. So those types of savings will help mitigate those sort of unanticipated costs that we have in the budget right now.
And how much, we haven't really, you alluded to it, but I don't think we've really focused on it. Just the fact that I wondered if you could speak a little bit to the change in the timing on the excise side from the state. And then also to Emma's point about how we've had to revise our expectations of what we're getting there downwards a few times. What's the potential swing for us?
Sure. So I'll do 2 seconds of background. So as part of the excise tax process with the state, they passed a law that allowed businesses, hotels and restaurants to hold back on sending their excise tax payments to the state, which then ultimately come back to the city for 1 year. So that basically delayed it from March of 2020 to April of 2021. So we're anticipating sort of a unusually high month in May once we get that payment from the state in April, but it's really going to be a reflection of all the sort of smaller payments that came in throughout the last 12 months. So that is something that we are sort of eagerly awaiting, and it's going to be a little bit hard to it's impossible for us to tell exactly how much is going to come in because we don't know how much has been withheld from us, but or has been withheld by businesses, but that'll sort of set the stage and actually help us sort of level set what we think a sort of new normal is, as I mentioned before, going into 22. So that'll help, I think, with our projections into next fiscal year. We revised down our projections in the excise tax process in the tax rate setting process for excise taxes, because even the returns we were getting, for the months of June through December were less than what we projected when we submitted the adopted budget back in June. So we've sort of made adjustments along the way to account for what we're seeing actually happen, with the idea being that hopefully some of that will be made up in the coming months with a larger April tax payment.
Yeah, but there's no way for us to get visibility on it sooner. I just asked because it's what you're describing sounds to me like a situation in which if we're scrambling, we'll be scrambling, in the midst of revising the FY22 budget. Like it'll be well after the introduction of it.
So I think we're probably in our adjustments to the tax rate where we took about that 49 million I mentioned, about 44 million came directly from a reduction to excise taxes. I think that's about as low, and I think we feel in our office, working with our revenue director, Moore Zoran, I think we feel very strongly that that's about as low as we can get, and I think we only have upside going forward into 22. With that said, as I mentioned to Councilor Arroyo, there will be a risk factor anytime we have revenue, especially where the impact is so dramatic as a public health, emergency shutdown or emergency restriction that we simply can't predict going into 22.
Okay, well, thanks. No, I mean, obviously, as long as we're conservative about it, that's one way of protecting ourselves. It's just a frustrating situation. Do we think that the state is going to persist in this into the next fiscal year, or do we think we'll go back to the old system?
I don't know. Honestly, I think it's a conversation that the legislature and I'm sure the executive office will have in the coming months.
I just, if any counselors with further follow-up questions can raise blue hands. Otherwise, I think we're coming towards the end. I wanted to just make a couple of remarks about kind of like going forward. One thing is just, obviously it's been important to us as the council to give the administration the power to act quickly and efficiently and use the CARES money, right? We passed that very large bucket back in like late April, early May, that 120. And as you said, you've sort of got 9 of it kind of sitting there waiting still to figure out exactly what we do with it, depending on what emergencies arise. And then the rest of it's kind of been programmed. I think it was important for us to get visibility on that today. I think that it sounds like we have significant other buckets in this type, right? So we've got that 120 at the schools. We've got some amount sitting over at housing right now. There's just a lot. And then you've got, who knows, 200, 300, 400 if this $1.9 trillion package passes. And I think to exactly the point that you raised, Justin, we need to be thinking about how we're building it in ways that support the current crisis and then are also sustainable. And it can't be that the council's looking at, looking at the budget that's out of the general fund and not looking at these major other components. So I really want to stress that I think this needs to be an ongoing part of our conversation this spring as we talk about the budget, and that as we get more clarity on the FEMA side, we need to understand that too. Because there are just, even the commercial rental relief fund, I know that was a pretty recent, fairly late breaking kind of development. I don't think the council has had any conversation about whether we're going to have a second round of that, whether that's budgeted for. So I still feel like we could have some more visibility on those things. I guess that is a question for me. Are we going to have another round of the commercial rental relief? And sort of, I think we've gotten more, D&D is the department where we've gotten the most detail on how they're spending their CARES money along the way. And we've done that through a series of council hearings. But that is a concern of mine. Sorry, I'll pause there because there is a question in that.
Sure. So I think happy to provide any information the council is looking for. I think the expectation from my view is that all that money that we sort of talked about through the CRF, that'll be spent by the end of this year if it hasn't been spent already, right? We've been at this for 9 months now with this funding, and a lot of it's been spent either in other places and needs to be moved over. So my expectation is that's all fully spent. The small bucket of money left over for emergencies is sort of paltry compared to how much we've spent over the last year, right? So if and when that federal money doesn't come, or if and when we look at an FY22 budget that is not as rosy as recent years have been, and we don't have that federal money, those services are going to need to be provided, right? I'm thinking of PPE. That's going to be something that's with us for probably ever, but at least the next year. That's been a big source, has been the CRF. And if that doesn't exist, or the CRF2 doesn't exist in some fashion, we're still going to need to buy the PPE, and it's going to have to come from somewhere else. So I think that's really going to be a challenge. And I think I certainly agree that, balancing all these different funds and balancing all these different sources is going to be a much bigger part of the 22 conversation than I think it ever has in previous years.
Yeah. And just concretely, is the commercial rental relief, can somebody just cover how much that is and whether we're doing another round of it?
I don't know off the top of my head. I will have to circle back on that.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we can send a follow up. And then I see Councillor Braden's got a hand raised.
I would also like some insights into where we are with the police budget. Like, I know we haven't discussed that at all, or is that even a reasonable question given that we haven't got a contract at the moment, or what's the story with that?
I'll just address the last question. I'll leave the hard question for Justin. It's absolutely a reasonable question. The contract is really about just obviously changes to the existing, sort of underlying contract, or contracts, I should say, since there are 4 of them. And so right, while I know we've talked a lot about the contract's ability to help us address or not some of these overtime issues, it doesn't, because we don't have a settled contract now, it doesn't necessarily impact anything aside from, to the extent that we were able to get reforms that we all have talked about that may into the future help us achieve some savings. But, given the fact that it's not settled now, it certainly wouldn't help us achieve any retro savings because obviously those things, sort of need to go into effect in order to achieve them. So it's a very good question, and I'm going to let Justin answer it.
I was almost afraid to ask the question, knowing that it was a difficult answer.
Good question, and happy to chat. I think it's twofold. One, we are constantly working with the police department to analyze and understand their budget. It is a daily thing. It is an ever-changing thing, and it has been very affected. BPD, BFD, EMS, they're on the front lines of responding to COVID-19 every single day. So there are certain expenses that, we're going to happen regardless, are going to continue regardless because of the response to COVID-19. And that's certainly something that, from a public safety and public health point of view, are going to have to continue to be funded. From a management perspective, from an overtime perspective, we continue to work with them to find efficiencies to hit their number. We will obviously be, working with them the rest of the year. We have also seen an unprecedented number of demonstrations and frankly, situations. I think about the election, and I think about all the different resources that were required to be implemented. That was certainly not something that we forecasted when we built the 21 budget. So that is going to be part of the conversation going forward. Or what were those events, and frankly, longstanding and unprecedented events that had to be paid for or had to be deployed, and how does that fit within the rest of their budget? I think that's something we're going to continue to work with them on, and we'll continue to work with them on going forward.
And in terms of the best teams, and they were paid for, the new increased personnel for the best teams that were paid for out of the 21 budget. Are there any anticipated additions to those personnel, or are we sort of in a static state for those? The mental health professionals who are going to co-respond with the officers.
But both the best clinicians and the BPH trauma teams that were supported as part of that $12 million reallocation were excluded from the hiring freeze. So we're able to move forward. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but our expectation is that that level of support for both the best clinicians and the neighborhood trauma teams will sort of be part of our baseline going forward into 22 and beyond.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. We're going to go in a minute to Pam Coker from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, who's here for public comment. I just wanted to express my thanks to this team. I think that we are facing a very challenging situation as we think about coming back from COVID. And I mean, we'll continuing to get through it, and we think about our kids, and we think about getting everybody vaccinated, and the economic recovery and the recovery from the trauma of it. But I think it's going to be really hard. And I don't think there's a city in America that we would want to change fiscal positions with right now. And as Emma said, there's some irony in that. I'm certainly one of many people who have said we are way too reliant on the property tax base. And I still think it's been alluded to a few times here that, like, we're getting significantly bailed out of a excise drop by new growth, and the sort of the prospect for operating like that going forward is not, I don't think it's an obvious one, and it doesn't necessarily make sense for us. But you have to appreciate good fortune when you have it. And the fact that we had a record bump in the property tax in the year that we were also experiencing the record decline in excise tax, and that they're balancing out, is a piece of good fortune today. And also just that, the fact that we're in this position of really strong fiscal stewardship where we were able to make those bond offerings, and we can actually have a robust capital budget and do these counter-cyclical things. I mean, I think it's worth noting in the midst of real challenge, that we're in a hard, but I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, sort of like as prepared as you can be for something that you can't be prepared for kind of position. So just want to thank you all for that work. And Councillor Braden, your hand's back up.
No, I just declined to take it down. I'll take it down now. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you to the team. And like I said, I just really want to make sure on the council side, it doesn't seem to me like we're going to be able to talk about the city budget without talking about these other funds that are coming in from the federal side. And I don't want the technicality of kind of source to put us in a position where we're having 2/3 of the conversation, just in terms of our role in fiscal oversight. And to Councillor Braden's point, we will definitely have another of our oversight hearings on the police overtime budget prior to the FY22 budget conversation. So more on that front. But I want to turn now to Pam Coker from the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, who's here with us to give public testimony. Pam?
Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me time at the end of your hearing to provide a few additional comments. I may be looking away from my screen just because I need my large monitor given my eyesight. So I wanted to pick up on a number of things that the councilors have asked about, and CFO Emma Handy and Budget Director Justin Sterrett have emphasized. So they've all done the numbers. I want to just emphasize a couple of dynamics. I just want to note, first of all, the city did come into the pandemic very strong fiscally, from an unprecedented economic boom to this unprecedented community challenge presented by the public health issues of COVID-19. We are also concerned as the Research Bureau about the multi-year impact potential of COVID, particularly on members of our community already challenged by housing issues, employment, and other foundational pieces of being able to sustain their work, their home life, and be part of a community. So we're particularly attentive right now to the importance and need for the city and the community to be responsive to folks that are already challenged and particularly challenged under the current situation. So one of our questions, of course, as you've already mentioned, is will CARES funding continue for as long as needed to help us through the impact of COVID-19? As Budget Director Justin Sterrett mentioned, there's concern about drop-off in federal support as we experienced during the Great Recession of 2009. So that is certainly a challenge. I want to highlight some other areas in which we see the city being challenged and affecting both the community part of the city as well as the economics of the city. Typically in recessions we've seen in the past, folks would tend to go back to school when employment was harder to find. And what we've seen this time around is clearly our higher education sector in Boston has been just as challenged in this particular situation because of the nature of it being a public health crisis, as institutions that would, in sectors that would normally be challenged in an economic crisis. So we are seeing among our higher education institutions, our medical institutions, and our cultural institutions as well, impacts that we might not have otherwise seen, particularly in higher ed. And as I just mentioned, the medical community, just because of the nature of this pandemic. And I would encourage the city to be a little bit more conservative in terms of potential for payment in lieu of taxes from those different business sectors in the community. I also want to talk a little bit quickly about something that we can't not mention here, potential impact on the city of the shift to remote work, particularly its impact on commercial real estate, both in terms of the value of existing real estate and whether projects in the development pipeline or even projects that have simply been permitted will actually be able to go forward if they're already started, get to completion, or if they haven't been started, will those projects in fact come online? New growth from additional new development in the city or renovations to a current both residential and business property in the city have been a huge benefit to the city's financial situation for a number of years now, since the Great Recession. So the possibility that that source might be challenged in the coming years, I think is something that we do want to pay attention to very much. And we appreciate that for fiscal 21, it looks like the city has budgeted relatively conservatively and not assumed another huge windfall from development activity in the city. I also want to touch on the property tax for just a minute. Due to the lag built into the assessing process, our experience in 2020, our experience this year in 2021 related to the impact of COVID on the public health of our city doesn't show up in property values until a few years hence. So the valuation date for fiscal year 2021 property was January of 2020, which captured market activity back in 2019. So simply to say there is a lag there, and it means any decrease in property value associated with the pandemic, if any, would show up probably in fiscal year 2022. So the year that we're preparing for now at the earliest, but it's possible that that could even be too early as some of the long-term impacts on our business sector and our residential community are maybe felt a little bit later on as they're continually challenged by the dynamics of the pandemic. So just to keep in mind, those are some of the things that we are particularly concerned about. I do appreciate the nod to a continuing commitment to funding obligations, including the pension and OPEB, because Boston has done that in the past. It's another reason why coming into this unexpected, unprecedented COVID-19 crisis, that the city is in relatively good shape to handle this, particularly compared to other cities. And I want to echo what Chair Bach mentioned about that. We are seeing that Boston is reasonably well positioned coming into this. We do need to, as I have just mentioned on a number of different areas, we do need to really continue to be very focused on how can we support our community through this and how can we be thoughtful coming out of this situation for some sustainable spending going forward as needed. We certainly hope that a pandemic situation such as we're in right now doesn't happen very often. Another 100 years would be plenty of time to give us a chance to be a strong city for a number of years financially, but always important to continue to be prepared and have the resources to address whatever situation comes along. I think that's about everything that I just wanted to highlight. Again, appreciate the comments and details from the city budget officials. And thanks for a few minutes at the end of your hearing.
Thank you so much, Pam. And we appreciate the Municipal Research Bureau's sort of sense of stewardship and the, tracking our long-term fiscal health enough to have those cautions and wisdoms to offer. I definitely think, I think we're in as I just said, a comparatively strong position, but with a lot of aspects to watch and a really daunting challenge, like, economically and in terms of on the human side, for how to come back from this. So thank you. And thank you again to Emma Handy, our CFO, Justin Sterrett, our budget director, and Drew Smith, our treasurer, for being with us today, and all my colleagues for coming and asking questions. With that, this hearing of the Boston City Council's Ways and Means Committee is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.